Villanova campus.
I think we're getting it this time now.
Oh, I see we are now streaming live on Facebook.
Perfect.
Awesome. Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for sticking with us through our technical difficulties while you were waiting for us to go live. My name is Nicole, and I'm with the Fieldhouse Museum, and I'm here today to welcome you to our author talk with Valerie Kienzle, who is author of What's with St. Louis and Lost St. Louis. Valerie, a non-native, has written a lot about the city. She was born in Nashville and attended the Missouri School of Journalism in Columbia and has spent the last 40 years employed in various writing-related positions. To tell her more about herself and her books, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Valerie.
Thank you, Nicole. I usually in talks, a little bit different format than this one. I will ask people, how many are you from St. Louis? How many are natives and how many are transplants? Usually it's about 2/3 to 3/4 people are natives. And so then I ask, okay, how much do you really know about your hometown? You think you know it all? Okay, well, let's check to be sure. And then we go to talk about what's with St. Louis. I met a few years ago the owner-publisher of Reedy Press out of South City, and his name is Josh Stevens. He, as a native, came up with a list of things he's always wondered about St. Louis. And me, I am an innate curious person. I always have questions. I had a lot of questions about St. Louis. So he said, let's both make lists. We'll put the list together. And that was the impetus behind What's with St. Louis, or as some people call it, What's with St. Louis? So if you look at the graphic, you can see there's lots of things that are associated with St. Louis, from the Blues, the Cardinals, foods, of course, the Mississippi River Forest Park. But there's a lot more to it too. So let's take a look, and we'll see the arch. We know that is identified with St. Louis, but St. Louis started really as a tiny, tiny little fur trading village in 1764. Pierre Leclerc and Auguste Chouteau and a few of their cohorts came up the Mississippi River from New Orleans. They were French descent and decided that with the proximity to this river and the other river they found, which was the Missouri, and yet another river, the Illinois, that this would be a really good place transportation-wise, and because it had not been explored or anything like that. So it'd be a good place to have a fur trading village. So the St. Louis we know today started from a tiny, tiny little village. And the riverfront was not always the way we see the riverfront today. At one time, it was a huge hill. And gradually, as it was developed, that hill was chopped away. So it now looks much like we know it today, with the levee that has the cobblestones. A lot of those stones, I understand, came from the tearing down of the hill. There used to be just 2 ways to get down actually to the river from what was considered the settlement of St. Louis. So this is the second edition of What's with St. Louis. The first edition, about 5 years ago, burned up in a huge warehouse fire that was in South City. There were about $250,000 books lost. And so we decided to reprint it. We took out some items, we put in some more items. So therefore we have now the second edition. So let's begin. I'd lived in St. Louis a long time before I found out what these were. And you see them all the time downtown. St. Louis has lots of lovely brick buildings, and we used to tailgate for Rams games down near Broadway, and there was a building that had the sign Mound City Buggy Company, and I wondered, what in the world is that? And then seeing things like International Shoe Company, which obviously used to be headquartered here, but I wondered about these signs. What I found out is they were the early forms of billboards. Before there were billboards, people would paint on signs. There were crews of men who would travel around the country on train. They would take their ladders and their buckets and their brushes. Of course, this was before OSHA standards, so they really had no secure ropes really to protect them. And they climbed up on their ladders and they traveled from city to city painting advertising on the sides of buildings. The owner of the building would get a small amount of money in exchange for them using the side of their building as a billboard. The paint they used was lead-based paint, which probably accounts for its durability. And I'm told that the way they centered the letters on the sides of the buildings was, if you've ever done like counted cross stitch or you have graph paper, it would be like finding the center of the graph paper and then counting squares out to the left and to the right, and then centering it that way. So these are called ghost signs. And if you keep your eyes open when you're down in the city in particular, you'll see them. And now that I know what they are, when I travel to other cities, I've noticed some of them too. So kind of interesting, a relic from the past. They were usually built close to railroad tracks, close to the river, close to places where there was pedestrian traffic, where lots of people hopefully would see them and then purchase the products. And speaking of 19th century, St. Louis, as I mentioned, has a lot of brick buildings. And the reason for that is the type of clay that's in Southwest St. Louis is called Cheltenham syncline. And it was perfect for the manufacture of bricks. Therefore, we ended up with lots of brick buildings. Well, the Southwest St. Louis section now we call the Hill. There were lots of Italian gentlemen that were looking for jobs that wanted to come to America. And this was a good place for them to work. It was hot work. It was long hours. It was strenuous work, but they came. And then they sent letters home with money, and they would send for their wives and families and parents as they saved money working in the brick kilns. And eventually more and more families came over here, and that's the neighborhood we know and love today as the Hill. Most of us don't think about the brick production. We think more of the delicious foods and the red, white, and green fire hydrants. But anyway, that was the start of the Hill area. Okay, St. Louis has had a long history of involvement with aeronautics. And we know that Gemini, some of the components were manufactured here in the early space program. But in 1910, air flight was very new. And Theodore Roosevelt had arrived in St. Louis on a riverboat and had traveled to what was called Kinloch Field. It is now Lambert St. Louis International Airport. But he had traveled out there, and he wanted to see an airplane demonstration. So, and it truly was just a field at that time. The runway was just dirt path, and really very primitive. So the gentleman on the right, his name was Arch Hoxsey. He was 23 years old. He was, I guess you'd say, sort of a daredevil pilot, didn't have a lot of fear. And the security detail for the president then was not what it is today. President Roosevelt was just standing on the sides of this dirt path that they were using for a runway. So Mr. Hoxsey decided to go up to him and see if he'd like to go for a ride in his airplane. Well, the president said, sure. So they got settled in this airplane, which was basically just canvas and ropes and wood and a motor. And then the newspaper account in the Post-Dispatch the next day said Mr. Hoxsey suddenly got nervous, because you may be able to tell from this picture, he was very slight of build, like in the 120s, and President Roosevelt was almost 300 pounds. So he really was concerned that this might not end that well. So nonetheless, he'd already committed himself. So he did take President Roosevelt up for 2 minutes. They flew over the field, came back in for a landing, no problem. And Mr. Hoxsey asked him, sir, what did you think? He said, it was fine. I actually loved it. And so that day, October 10th, President Roosevelt became the first US president to fly, and it was here in St. Louis. Another first. Okay. Belle Fountain Cemetery. Some of you may have heard of it. It's a huge cemetery, sort of north of town, and hundreds of acres. And then beside it is its neighbor, which is Calvary Cemetery. The one thing we're given in life is that we all know someday we will die. And where else can the famous and the infamous mix and mingle but in cemeteries? So the two cemeteries were formed at a time there had been a cholera epidemic in St. Louis around 1849. And at that time, a lot of the churches in downtown St. Louis had cemeteries that were attached to them. And there was some people that thought that perhaps that wasn't the most sanitary of conditions. So St. Louis, having its French founders, they decided to follow what was called a Parisian, it was called the rural cemetery movement. It was a Parisian thing. It was very popular over there in France. So the cemeteries were moved very far away from downtown area. And so that's where the burials took place. Calvary Cemetery is owned by the Archdiocese of St. Louis. And some of its famous people include Tennessee Williams, the writer, former slave Dred Scott, and Civil War General William Tecumseh Sherman. Some of the famous people in Belle Fountain include explorer William Clark and Sarah Teasdale and Adolphus Bush. So they have hundreds and hundreds of acres, and there is plenty of room for more. One of the things I found in doing research about the cemeteries was there was a story, right around the last part of the 19th, early 20th century. There was a very famous, popular, wealthy madam, and her name was Eliza Haycroft, and she conducted her business downtown. So the story goes that she approached the board of directors at Belle Fountain Cemetery and said, I'm getting old, I know my demise is coming, and I'd like to purchase a plot. And apparently they said, oh, no, we don't want your type. So the story goes that she looked around the room at some of them and said, okay, then I'm going to inform your wives how I know you. Well, guess what? Not only did she get to buy one plot, she got to buy a whole big parcel. And so her grave is still there, and it's very demurely marked. The newspaper account said that she was very popular, and there were approximately 1,000 people that lined the streets from downtown to Belle Fountain Cemetery when her hearse and caisson passed. And I'm also told that she donated her sizable wealth to widows and orphans. So that's an interesting story. Okay, well, we all know St. Louis is famous for beer, but did you know that at one time, St. Louis was an incubator for soft drink companies? There was that unfortunate occurrence called Prohibition that happened between 1920 and 1933, when all alcoholic beverage production came to a screeching halt, which was really devastating for St. Louis. There were so many breweries here. So in order to try to bring back work to people who had worked in the breweries, people who had manufactured wooden crates and cases for bottles, people, glass manufacturers, some brainstorming was done, and there were some soft drinks introduced. Howdy Orange, there was one called Smile, there was one called IBC Root Beer, and then there was 7UP. And so these really helped to keep the workers in that industry going when beer production came to a screeching halt. The other thing, somebody at one of my talks said to me, well, you know, there was bathtub gin, there was homebrew going on. And so people probably needed something to mix with their bathtub gin. So anyway, another interesting story about 7UP. Being founded here in St. Louis, the gentleman who created the formula, his name was C.L. Grigg. And I worked at the 7UP company when its world headquarters was in Clayton. And we were constantly asked, what is the origin of the name? Well, Mr. Grigg was a very private person, apparently, and we could never find anywhere in the company records where it had been written down why he decided to call his product 7UP. When it was introduced 2 weeks before the stock market crash in October of 1929, it was called bib label lithiated lemon lime soda, which is just a whole mouthful of a name. But it was soon thereafter changed to 7UP. The most frequent guess that we heard, and that as workers we figured must have been it, it has 7 ingredients, thus 7UP. So interesting story about working for 7UP. The technical center where they produce the extract for 7UP is at I-170, and well, it's on I-170. So the extract is made from the peels, the oils and the peels of fresh lemons and limes. And the waste product would be the rest, the pulp, the juice, the seeds. And so what they would do with those, we called them nudie lemons. They were lemons that had had just the very minimum peeling scraped off of them. There would be boxes and boxes of these brought to the headquarters building in Clayton, and you knew when they arrived because shortly the whole building smelled like fresh lemons. And that was one of our perks. We could drink all the 7UP we wanted when we were at work, and occasionally we got crates of these nudie lemons. I will tell you, I purchased a juicer and made some wonderful lemon bars and lemon meringue pies during those days when we got the fresh lemon juice. So that was 7UP has a long history with St. Louis. Okay, this is a picture of St. Louis's first public high school. It's not a very good picture, but this was from a very long time ago on a postcard. And it was called Central High School. It was downtown, not too far from where some of the stadiums are now. But when I moved to St. Louis, I kept being asked, where'd you go to high school? And I thought that was the strangest question, because coming from Nashville, nobody ever asked, where'd you go to high school? I guess nobody cares. But I would be at barbecues in people's backyards talking over the fence. People were forever asking, where'd you go to high school? And I couldn't understand. So in some of my research, I talked to people in St. Louis that were all ages, all stages, and asked them what they thought, because I could not find an answer. Some people said it had to do with high school rivalry, football team rivalry. You couldn't date somebody if they went to your big rival high school. Other people said it was a way to determine what parish you lived in, or to see if you knew a cousin that lived maybe in that part of town. Still, other people said it was a social judgment, that you were trying to determine the net worth of people based on where they lived. So for this particular question, I guess there's really no one set answer. And some of the things in the book, it's that way. You can't determine a set answer. So we'll just leave this one right there, and you could come to your own conclusions. Okay. This is a piece of rock. This can be found on North Broadway, near where the Stan Musial Bridge comes to a terminus. And it is all that's left of what used to be huge mounds. When I first moved here, I saw things like Mound City Buggy Company and Mound City Nut Company, and had no idea what the origin was. Well, then I found out that back in the early 19th century, the steamboat captains would know they were approaching St. Louis because St. Louis had more than 24 mounds in the area, and they knew they were approaching St. Louis on the river when they saw these mounds, much like what Cahokia Mounds is today, I suppose. But these really were ceremonial, sacred places for Native Americans. It's estimated that they were probably made like 10,000 years ago. But St. Louis at the time was building and growing, and there was not the attention to things of historical significance. And so gradually, as the city grew, the mounds were scooped away and torn away and destroyed. some of the mounds, the dirt was used in building up the beds for the railroad tracks. About that time, the railroads were coming into St. Louis, and so they had to build up the railroad beds. Even like there were some in Forest Park that were destroyed in order to make way for the 1904 World's Fair. So this is all that's left of what was called Big Mound, and it was just huge. And for those of you who may know this, or you may not, there's only one mound left in St. Louis, and it overlooks I-55. For many decades, it had a little house built on top of it. And truth be told, that's probably what saved it from destruction. But that house, the person that lived there has since passed, and that house and the mound have now been given to the Osage Indians, who promised that they will always protect it and keep it a sacred property. Okay, this reminds me of the fence around the old courthouse downtown. If you've ever been down there and walked around and seen, there's lots of history that took place there. There's part of a fence, and if you look really close, there are little images, little icons of turtles on the fence. Interesting story was, in the 1870s, that was the center of St. Louis activity, the courthouse. There were all kinds of things that took place there. That's where the Dred Scott case was decided. It was just a hubbub of St. Louis activity. 1870s, there was a custodian who worked there. His name was James Sexton. And he did a really good job. He was a one-man band, took care of the whole courthouse. And he got outside, he cleaned the ponds, he did the inside, and he got to know this little turtle. And he would bring the turtle scraps of the tops of vegetables and things like that, and sort of adopted it as a pet and took it upon himself to feed it. Well, St. Louis, being what it is, had like a really early cold snap, and the turtle had not been gotten out of the water outside, and the turtle died. And so one of the newspapers, I think it was the Post-Dispatch, ran an obituary for the turtle. And Mr. Sexton was quoted as saying that was the only thing in St. Louis's courthouse that didn't cost the taxpayers a penny, because he had fed and cared for it. So when the courts were moved to what's called the Civil Courts building now in 1930, and for a while the old courthouse sat there and was kind of falling into disrepair. And then it was decided, yeah, this is really historic. It's a treasure, and it was renovated, and it's become a historic site. Well, when they were doing the renovations, they decided to pay homage to this little turtle that had lived there. So part of the wrought iron fence down there was made by Kupfer, I think is the name of the company. They're still in St. Louis, and they made the fence and put the little image of the turtle in it to remind people, those who may or may not know the story, there was a turtle that once lived there too. Okay, have you ever driven in St. Louis, especially down in the city, maybe South City, and seen a sign like this? Ever wondered what it meant? I sure did. And then I found out. Brains, this is for brain sandwich. And obviously this is a ghost sign from a long time ago to have 25 cents. Brain sandwich is somewhat of a delicacy, I guess, for some, but it's also economical. I learned that there's some great little diners down in the city that produce it. There's a place called Schatzi's, and they are known for their brain sandwiches, and they put it on rye bread with hot mustard and pickles and a slice of onion, and supposedly it's really good. The owner of Schatzi's told me it was all in the preparation, how the brains are prepared and floured and whatnot. And his sandwiches apparently are so good that the Food Channel came and paid him a visit a few years back. And he says he always knows when the episode featuring Schatzi's has aired, because he will have all these young people, young adults, come in and say, hey, I want to try one of your brain sandwiches. And he sells a lot of them. The one thing that's different now compared to like when the sign was put up after the mad cow scare, the mad cow disease scare a few years back. The brains are no longer cow brains, they are now pork brains. So interesting story, but it is a St. Louis food, St. Louis specialty. Okay, other thing I wondered, I went to the Missouri Botanical Garden and wondered why in the world is there a Japanese garden in a Midwestern city. I couldn't understand it. So did some research, found out that the Japanese American Culture League approached the Botanical Garden in the early 1970s and asked, could they put some kind of garden or some kind of area in that they would pay for and design. And the Botanical Garden said yes. It had been just a grove of trees. I think it was about 14 acres up to that point. And so there was a well-known Japanese landscape architect named Huachi Kawana. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And so he was very well known for his garden designs. So he is the one who designed this garden. And so the next time you go there, just try to be cognizant of the fact that everything is placed for a reason, to be visually enlightening and entertaining. There are odd numbers of things, and it's a type of garden that's called hide and reveal, because as you walk and progress through it, you will constantly be seeing something new as you round corners and see different statues and things. And it's a real jewel that we have here in St. Louis, something else to be very proud of. Okay, and then there's this funky bridge. Moved here and thought, what in the world is with that bridge? It was old, but it was obviously still in use. And it took me a number of years to figure out that it was called the Eads Bridge. And it had a very storied past. It had many firsts to it. It's considered really an anomaly at the time. It was opened on July 4th, 1874. It's entirely cantilevered construction. It has 3 arches. It used tubular cord to frame out the bridge's steel arches, and it also used steel alloy instead of iron, which at that time all bridges were made of iron. So this was something really, really novel. And something else that was novel was James Eads was a very wealthy businessman in St. Louis. He was not trained as an engineer. However, growing up, he loved to visit his godfather's library, and he would read books. His godfather was an engineer, so he would read these engineering books. And there were many naysayers in St. Louis at the time that said, Mr. Eads, what are you thinking? You know nothing about bridge construction. You've never constructed a bridge. How do you know what you're doing? You're going to be a failure. You're going to make a mistake. His quote was, must we admit that because a thing has never been done, it never can be? And admittedly, it took 7 years to build this marvel, but it is still up. It's never fallen in. It's still functional. One of the other innovations that Mr. Eads designed was something somewhat like a capsule, and it was used to put workers down inside the capsule, and then the capsule was sunk into the water. Some of the piers go down as much as 100 feet down into the water. The only thing was, at the time, they didn't know that if you pulled somebody up very quickly in the water, oftentimes they can get the severe stomach cramps called the bends. And there were about 10 people that died as a result of having that. And so anyway, we still have this marvelous bridge, and it is truly beautiful. So take a good look at it next time you're downtown. I did not realize that St. Louis had such a long history of involvement in the civil rights movement. And it took living here and just on my own starting to read and to look at things and to hear about things to realize the extent of the civil rights movement in St. Louis. My first aha moment came at the Missouri History Museum's library, research library, that used to belong to a Jewish temple. And I looked up, I've been looking, it's just beautiful. It's fabulous. If you ever go in there, look at the ceiling. And I saw the Star of David. And so I started wandering around. I got sidetracked from my research, and I found this small plaque, brass plaque, that said Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke here, and it had the date. I've never heard that before. So I started doing some more research, found out that Dr. King actually spoke here 6 different times. He spoke at the old Kiel Auditorium. He spoke at St. Louis University. This was actually in the gymnasium at St. Louis University. He spoke at United Hebrew Temple, Temple Israel, and Washington Tabernacle Baptist Church, and also the Christ Cathedral downtown. So during his 1964 speech, which is this picture shows, he was talking to SLU student government. And he said, while the law can't change the heart of men, it does change the habits. And in time, habits change attitudes. And I think that's a really interesting thought to consider. Okay. St. Louis fish fries. Why is that a thing? Wondered about that. It just seems like, especially during the season of Lent in the spring leading up to Easter, fish fries are everywhere. And I was so curious about that. I mean, we like fish in Nashville where I grew up, but not to the extent that people did here. And so I started asking questions, and I ended up talking to the spokesperson for the St. Louis Archdiocese. His name is Gabe Jones. And he said that in the weeks leading up to Easter and the weeks of Lent, that there are 75 to 100 parishes that will host fish fries. Amazing. Okay, and you know, fish fries are not necessarily for people who are looking to count calories, because you've got coleslaw, you've got French fries, you've got sometimes macaroni and cheese, or you might have shrimp, you can have baked or fried fish, sometimes hush puppies. So it's not for calorie conscious people, but it sure does taste delicious. One thing that Mr. Jones told me was there are certain places, certain dioceses in the country that give dispensations during Lent that certain semi-aquatic animals are able to be served in addition to fish. For example, up in Detroit, the Archdiocese has given muskrat a dispensation. So some people eat that as an acceptable meat substitute. And meat substitutes have been used for thousands of years. Think what you will about eating a muskrat. Also in Louisiana, alligator is acceptable. And from time to time, there are rumors that beaver, which is very common here in Missouri, is an acceptable and has been given a dispensation as a meat substitute. And I asked Mr. Jones about that. He said, no, absolutely not. There is a restaurant downtown that promotes the sale of beaver during Lent, but no, it has not been given a dispensation by the Archdiocese. There is only one Catholic church in the Archdiocese that serves something other than fish shrimp, and that's frog legs, and that would be St. Peter Catholic Church in St. Charles. So if you're looking for good food, that's the place to go. So anyway, I've covered a lot here. We've talked about a lot of different aspects. The book contains more than 75 different aspects of what makes St. Louis a unique and wonderful place in which to live. So if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer questions at this time. And if you'd like what you've heard today and you want to purchase the book, it's available at all the local bookstores, Left Bank Books, Subterranean Books, Main Street Books. Love to support local bookstores. So are there any questions?
Okay, we actually do have a few questions. One is, are you going to be doing a volume 3 with even more stories?
There's been talk. There were some items that didn't make it into either book, so that's a distinct possibility. And me being the curious person, I've still got more ideas. Yeah.
Okay, and what is your favorite landmark here in St. Louis?
Well, that's a tough one. I love the Campbell House Museum. It's down on Locust Street, and it just sits by itself. It was one time part of the very elite of St. Louis Street that lived there, and it was called Lucas Place. And it's like taking a step back in time. It's just, it's furnished with some of the family's antiques, and I think it's interesting to see a different way of life, much, much different than the way we live today.
Okay, and since we have a little bit more time and no more questions right now, do you want to tell us a little bit about some of your other books?
Okay, I wrote a book with, in conjunction with the St. Charles County Historical Society. They had what turned out to be a fabulous postcard collection. Postcards were very popular and commonly used right around the turn of the 19th, the early 20th century. Penny postcards, you've probably heard that term. But there was a photographer named Rudolf Goebel, and he was originally from Germany, and he resided in St. Charles and was one of those people. He forever had his camera with him. And that was in the days when cameras were rather big and cumbersome, but he had taken just probably thousands of photographs. Plus he did portraits also, but he had these postcards made up with some of his images. And the Historical Society had them in a file cabinet. And I asked, could I do something with them? And so we worked on it together and found out the story behind each of the images. So there was that book. I worked in conjunction with the State Historical Society of Missouri in Columbia to do a book on Columbia. It's such a neat small town. It has the 3 universities. It's got a lot of culture and a lot going for it that some towns maybe with their population wouldn't necessarily have going for it. So that was an interesting book as well, to read some of the backstories and to gather the information based on images that were in the State Historical Society's files. Lost St. Louis talks about some of the buildings and places and way of life that are no more in St. Louis. At one point, mid-20th century, St. Louis went through something called a raise craze, where the buildings, their architectural significance wasn't necessarily valued, and things were just torn down. For example, when the Gateway Arch grounds did not always look the way they do now. It was 40 blocks of residences and buildings. Some of them were old, yes, but some of them were really architecturally significant. It was decided there was going to be some kind of landmark put down by the river, and at that time there was no plan, and everything was just raised. Everything was torn down 40 blocks, and so it sat like that for a number of years before the arch was finally completed and opened in the mid-1960s. So things like that are kind of hard to see for me anyway, because I do value architecture. And if you take a close look again down in the city, some of the flats and some of the buildings, if you look at the architectural detail, particularly the brickwork, there were a lot of immigrants, people who came from Europe, who have been trained in those skills and doing brickwork and frescoes and things like that. And so I'm one of those people, when I'm downtown, I'm looking up. I'm looking to see the gargoyles and some of the statuary, or the arches, the round arches made with brick. So some of those things have been lost, but yet some of them have been preserved, and it's really wonderful to see that.
Okay, and I know we asked that if there was going to be a volume 3 of What's with St. Louis, but do you have any other things or projects in the works right now?
I do. There is a book that Reedy is going to produce. It will come out next spring, and it's called Ready to Wear. And it looks at the history of the footwear industry, which was huge in St. Louis, and also the ready-made clothing industry in St. Louis. And it was also a large segment of the economy. In fact, a quick fact, if you're familiar with the junior dress sizes or junior clothing sizes for teenage girls, that concept was developed here in St. Louis.
That sounds really interesting.
Yeah. So.
Okay. Well, I think that's about it for today. So thank you so much for joining us over the internet today. And thank you to everyone who watched and participated and joined in for the discussion. Be sure to stay tuned to the Fieldhouse Museum's Facebook page and online on our website to see what other future events that we might have going on. This is a continuing series here with our author talks, and we're really glad that you were able to join us today, Valerie. This is really, really interesting. And I mean, I'm a native of St. Louis, and some of these things I had no idea about, like the turtles down at the courthouse.
And now you'll look, right?
Yes, I will. So thank you again. And thank you everyone who came in and again was a part of it. We hope to see everyone soon, hopefully. So until then, we'll continue as we are. So.